Good day, YouTube. I make myself known once more, and in this case heralded by a prior edition of my works. If you have yet to witness the anteceding video, I beseech you to do so, as it serves to both predicate this work, and likewise one may in of itself procure information, both intriguing and possibly auspicious, on the matter of British abolitionism. As hitherto covered, slavery is invariably a wretched and repugnant affair which contravened all fathomable ethical philosophies and economic cogitations. Likewise, Britain served as a vector in which abolitionism propagated about, and as the point of convergence for multiple classes antithetical to slavery, and the general character of the nation, being so, serving as a point from which emancipation originated in proper. It ought to be disclaimed that this essay is not created as to expunge other nations' work against slavery, and thus it ought be mentioned within the prefacing section, other people's endeavours against the scourge. Of particular mention is the Americas, once beset by slavery on an industrial scale, both predating European conquest, the natives doing so to one another for labour, honour and sacrifices, whilst the Spanish shackled any whom refused to relent their native faiths. This, as of the papacy, exclaiming the use of slavery amongst Christian peoples upon one another, however not precluding its use upon non-Christians. However, the nebulously named New Laws, or more explicit, New Laws of the Indies for the good treatment and preservation of the Indians, served to provide reprieve to all natives in the Spanish colonies in 1542, coming into effect on the 20th of November. These, whilst not prohibiting slavery, served as an amnesty to the natives, allowing them reprieve from the Spanish yoke, albeit as of the rancour of settlers, these were only partially successful in their stated purpose. Notwithstanding that, there were also the endeavours of the French. In the early Dark Ages, Balfield of Chelles, an erstwhile slave who served as Queen Consort of Burgundy and Neustria, and summarily regent from 657, ostensibly prescribed slave trading at some stage within her rule, and took it upon herself to purchase and extricate slaves. However, with the introduction of feudalism, slavery itself would wane. Likewise, King Louis X prohibited slavery anywhere in the French metropole. In 1315, with a decree marked with the watchword "France signifies freedom," hence any slave to set foot upon French soil was to be freed. Summarily, with the Enlightenment, the slavery within the French colonial empire, consigned to their colonies as of the aforementioned declaration, would conclude. A slave revolt in Saint Domingue, resulting in regional administrators sent by the National Assembly prohibiting the practice, albeit without jurisdiction to introduce such. The generally circumspect yet anti-slavery members of the National Assembly, however, were rather jubilant at this serendipitous turn of events, however, in 1793. This would later be rescinded by Emperor Napoleon, whom sent an expedition over to the colony to reinstate slavery, racked by disease and blighted by the pernicious and inclement weather, such being particularly torrid. They were forced to relent, resulting in the creation of Haiti. European dominion notwithstanding, China briefly attempted to repress the practice under Zhu Yuozhang, whom ruled as the first emperor of the Ming dynasty from 1368 to 1393. Albeit as of their general difficulties with administration, this policy was oft eclipsed by other matters and pragmatism. Anyhow, with that divulged, we may now proceed upon more pertinent matters, particularly Britain's involvement in abolitionism. For that we must return our gaze to the latter 1700s and early 1800s, and transfix ourselves there. In this annal of history, we previously dedicated our interest to the preceding events which defined and facilitated the eventual extirpation of British slavery. This preoccupation concludes now with a focus on the conclusive stages of the abolition movement, or rather, that in which their yearnings are effectuated. Antedating the Union of Britain, the constituent state, which would eventually comprise such, possessed varying sentiments upon slavery. England had the perspicacious view that slavery was, indeed, a flagitious act. The Church Council of London, convened by Anselm of Canterbury, Archbishop of Canterbury from 1093 to 1109, in 1102 issued a proclamation that "let no one dare hereafter to engage in the infamous business prevalent in England of selling men like animals." This to be extrapolated as perchance an early expression of the inalienable natural rights of man, under the pretext that all men, by virtue of both their ability to imbue their labour to things, and that all are equal under God. Likewise, this is congruent with papal dogma, the conception of imago Dei, image of God, an imperative which the Church follows. It is thus that all are rendered equal, as they are all facsimiles to some degree of the Lord, and are created by his divine hand, thus are not to be impinged upon, as they are one's equals in this regard by virtue of birth. Most inauspiciously, however, by virtue of this being a mere clerical convocation, the declaration held no real authority, as it was the remit of the king at the time to pass legislation, and thus without his approbation, it never held any authority, and thus is to be regarded as fanciful or a mere admission of platitudes. Slavery did, however, ebb during the age following the Norman conquest, with the introduction of the feudal system. This system, where the king maintained propriety over all lands, but under the technological constraints of the time, let the land out to various vassals. These fiefs, as they were then further apportioned from clergy and lords to knights or petty lords, and so on, with this latter mentioned phase, generally the last, with peasants included to tend the land as serfs. Hence, slavery was superseded by this new system. It is of import, however, to make mention that a good portion of the population, however, were nonetheless free. A good deal unfettered with bindings to the land. Even then, one could occasionally transfer to another lord's charge, or have reprieve to go on pilgrimage or regress for other important reasons. Notwithstanding that, however, slavery remained nominally, but in essence was expunged, as of its redundancy. Captives, otiose in comparison to willing servants tied to the land. Another point to mention in the course of slavery within Britain is the Somerset's case, or by official nomenclature, Somerset v. Stewart. Such entailed the right for an enslaved person to not be dispatched to Jamaica for sale whilst on English soil. This, after Somerset was brought as a slave from America to England after having been bought by Stewart to be sold to Jamaica after an escape attempt in England. Therein, in 1772, the contest concluded, with the verdict that there existed no pretext for slavery within English common law. The Court of King's Bench Judge, Lord Mansfield, concluding, "The state of slavery is of such a nature that it is incapable of being introduced on any reasons, moral or political, but only by positive law, which preserves its force long after the reasons, occasions, and time itself from whence it was created is erased from memory. It is so odious that nothing can be suffered to support it but positive law. Whatever inconveniences, therefore, may follow from the decision, I cannot say this case is allowed or approved by the law of England, and therefore the black must be discharged." This, according to one account of the verdict. This is a rather benignant and intriguing ruling, which demonstrates the domestic neglect of slavery within Britain. While circumscribed to the colonies, domestically slavery was nigh expunged. Now, upon the matter at hand, manumittance and the abolition of the slave trade, all such legislation may be perceived as the progeny of the Slave Trade Act 1807. The Slave Trade Act was derived primarily from the influence of the much lionised William Wilberforce. This in conjunction with the 35 to 40 saints in Parliament who were implicated with the group and coalesced into a cohesive bloc antithetical to the trade. This desideration was largely engendered by their faith, as their moniker may allude to. William Wilberforce, for instance, writing in his diary on the 28th of October, 1787, "God Almighty has set before me two great objects, the suppression of the slave trade and the reformation of manners." Herein, we may intimate the importance of this quest bestowed upon them, and thus their ardour in engendering the change required to satisfy it. Many members of this embroiled in the cause for a greatly protracted period of time, some their entire lives. Wilberforce was greatly invested within the cause and incessantly introduced motions upon it. The one tabled on the 2nd of April 1792, wherein it followed thus, that the trade carried on by British subjects for the purpose of obtaining slaves on the coast of Africa ought to be abolished, met the fate of the first one posited in 1791. The 1791 one a failure, with 163 opposed to 88, a rather deaf repudiation by Parliament and the House of Commons. Henry Dundas, another protagonist against the slave trade, was present for the second vote, and it produced a petition by the Edinburgh constituency corroborating his thoughts. However, he peculiarly opposed the bill by circumspection around foreign nations, believing that other nations would merely utilise this withdrawal to increase their share in the slave trade, albeit, he confirmed, "My opinion has always been against the slave trade." As to ameliorate the act, however, he proposed an amendment to add gradually to the bill. This trade must be ultimately abolished, but by moderate measures, he espoused. The amendment passed 192 for, 125 against, and in the amended motion, 230 to 85 opposed. Therein, however, despite the prodigious success of this early bill, its attempts at complete liberation were stymied by issues pertaining to the independent West Indies legislature, and thus he proposed an amelioration bill to improve slave conditions in the meantime. This, however, was the most vexing and burdensome constraint, far from commodious for other alternative action. Summarily, 3 weeks later, Dundas proposed a plan for the phased elimination of slavery itself by 1799. Parliament were to hark his word that proceeding fleetly would result in West Indies continuance in a different mode and other channels. He likewise beseeched them to proceed with the plan, as if the committee would give the time proposed, they might abolish the trade, but on the contrary, if this opinion was not followed, their children yet unborn would not see the end of the traffic. After proposals to end the trade in 1794 or 95, the House of Commons decided upon the date of 1796. However, this was all in vain, as the House of Lords withheld consent to the bill and its alterations on the 5th of June 1792. After a few tenuous years of governance, the House of Lords began to have a magnified abolitionist presence. Lord Grenville, in his meagre stint as Prime Minister himself, attempting to resuscitate the bill. Greatly auspicious, however, was the Acts of Union of 1800, which introduced the Irish to Parliament, with 100 new seats introduced. Most of said Irish politicians affiliated with abolitionism, or having in the least found the notion alluring. Now, with these amenable circumstances, the bill was introduced once more in January 1807, dispatched to the House of Commons on the 10th of February, and by the 23rd of February 1807, the second reading of the bill was approved, and after a lengthy 10-hour session, it finally passed by a prodigious 283 to 16. William himself was purportedly rendered Larimose with jubilation at the conclusion of his 20-year endeavour. As is customary, the King, George III, provided his assent on the 23rd of March, with a deadline of effect to enter into force on the 1st of May 1807. The Kitty's Amelia was the last slave ship to depart legally on the 27th of June 1807, thus concluding in British involvement in the slave trade, and now the single power to cease slave trading, notwithstanding the colony of Upper Canada, which had prohibited the trade of slaves in 1793 with its acts against slavery. Such a bill may be seen to have unleashed the mental fecundity of British parliamentarians in regard to slavery. Sundry bills pertinent released in ancillary to it. The Slave Trade Felony Act 1811, consummating the efforts of the 1807 bill by rendering participation in the slave trade a felony offence. Likewise, eventually the possession of slaves was rendered criminal. The Slavery Abolition Act 1833 engendering this. Therein, such stemmed from the decline of plantations in the New World, the use of slaves far more lucrative than trading them, sugar planters' profits dwindling from 1823, however, resulting in their political power being vitiated. Likewise, their prior endeavours to purchase boroughs with rather meagre populations, some towns were provided in a special charter entitling them to parliamentary representation, were concluded with the 1832 Reform Act, which incidentally included further expanded franchise, allowing more males to vote with lower property restrictions. With the obviation of venality in the form of bribery, precluded by attenuated profits, and the purchase of these rotten or pocket boroughs, the Act was able to be passed. This also coming off the 1831 Baptist War in Jamaica, which was a rather ruinous slave revolt. An act for the abolition of slavery throughout the British colonies, for promoting the industry of the manumitted slaves, and for compensating the persons hitherto entitled to the services of such slaves, as its proper appellation goes, is passed with the approval of the King on the 28th of August 1833, and came into effect on the 1st of August 1834. An exemption was provided to the East India Company, Ceylon, and St. Helena, however, which continued until the 1843 Indian Slavery Act. As to propitiate those possessing slaves, they were to be provided recompense for their losses, this to be of £20 million sterling. Therein, this to be financed by a £15 million loan and £5 million from direct government stock, worth £1.5 billion in contemporary money in all. This technically taking taxpayers until 2015 to repay. However, with how British gilts work, this is a mere technicality that rather than as the extent of it. However, £20 million sterling was 40% of annual treasury income and 5% of the GDP of Britain at the time, so nevertheless a great sum. The actual means of abolition was as thus. Children under 6 were to be immediately manumitted. Those of the age of 6 or older were designated apprentices and concluded after 2 stages. The first apprenticeship concluding on the 1st of August 1838 and the second on the 1st of August 1840. Thus, in this transitory stage, for approximately 6 years, with 4 for the initial period and 2 for the latter. The second reading of the bill passed the House of Commons on the 22nd of July 1833 with no opposition, a mere week before the passage of William Wilberforce. Thus, one may imagine him expiring with content. Thence, with that concluded, we may review the following endeavours to export this newfound liberty globally in the Victorian period, also known as Pax Britannica. Pax Britannica, Latin for British peace, was a period of time in which Britain acceded to the state of global hegemon, their dominion maintaining global peace and prosperity. Their global influence may be ascribed to the elimination of France in the Napoleonic Wars, and its conclusion, that of World War I, thus 1815 to 1914. We may, however, if we wish, round that approximate 99 years to 100 if we count Napoleon's exile to Elba as the start of this period, albeit that would be somewhat disingenuous, as he still unerringly continued to be a threat to British power. With this unprecedented power and a state of globalization, Britain set upon establishing an empire and legacy to rival the Romans in its works across the globe as the torch of civilization. Their service as the world police comprised primarily of their general opposition to slavery. For those of my audience who are Anglo-Celtic such as myself, we may take solace in that our empire did not merely consist of the largest assemblage of territory under one state ever witnessed, 24% of the globe, but that it heralded mankind into a new era, one where labour was supplanted by the machine, thus extricating the populace and allowing a more luxurious lifestyle for all. But also that it led the way in instituting a nascent moral order predicated upon our liberal values and Christian sense of morality. This is a legacy to pride ourselves upon, and one that is indelible and may never be surpassed by virtue of the unprecedented technological achievements which we unleashed upon the world. Anyhow, enough laudatory espousals from me. As to their opposition to slavery, such commenced within their own continent, however estranged from it they may have been. Sundry articles and treaties enforcing this prohibition were lodged both hitherto the end of the Coalition Wars and within the subsequent period of Pax Britannica. The Anglo-Portuguese Treaty of 1810, the first of these, with Portugal agreeing to limitations on their own trade with their colonies. In 1813 there was the Anglo-Swedish Treaty, which had Sweden outlaw the slave trade domestically. The 1814 Treaty of Paris had the French concede that the trade was, quote, repugnant to the principles of natural justice, and to cease for 5 years involvement in the trade. The 1814 Anglo-Dutch Treaty had the Dutch prohibit the slave trade, whilst the 1817 Anglo-Spanish Treaty had the Spanish repress the trade by 1820. The United States, perhaps in emulation of this, prohibited the importation of slaves from the Atlantic, within the Act prohibiting the importation of slaves, which passed on the 2nd of March 1807, a month following the British instance of this, albeit this may just be an independent development by virtue of America essentially being an Anglo-Saxon nation, and with Canada, their neighbour, independently outlawing the trade themselves a decade prior. Likewise, the idiosyncratic behaviour of Britain demonstrates their genuine desire to expunge trade. Their use of the Royal Navy to enforce the ruling globally indicative of this. The West Africa Squadron, established 1808, to patrol around the area and seize slave ships, whereby they would free their cargo. Fines of up to £100 per head were to be dispatched, though unfortunately ship crews would cast slaves into the ocean to avoid fines. All in all, between 1808 and 1860, 150,000 slaves were extricated, and approximately 1,600 slave ships seized, with the Royal Navy declaring all ferrying slaves were to be treated as pirates. Punitive measures were to be exacted upon the gluttonous African kingdoms who had historically supplied slaves to the trade in their continual raids. Those who did not resign themselves to treaties enforcing abolition found themselves prey to British depredation, such as the King of Lagos in Nigeria, who was expelled in 1851. Seeing this, many were less apprehensive to sign British treaties, with in excess of 50 native rulers adhering to this demand. The Slave Trade Brazil Act 1845, or the Aberdeen Act, in congruence with these prior actions, entitled the British Navy to assail slave ships around Brazil, is hectoring coercing them to eliminate slavery in its entirety. The full act name, an act to amend an act, entitled an act to carry into execution a convention between His Majesty and the Emperor of Brazil for the regulation and final abolition of the African slave trade. This engendered by the repudiation of the British-Brazilian Convention of 1826, despite the Emperor Pedro's support lying with it, as he himself supported abolition. His people, not much so. Said convention had prohibited the African trade. It also had the advantage of protesting tariffs placed on British goods at the time. Furthermore, with the reports of Dr. Livingstone on the Arabian slave trade, the prior wrath and zeal of Britain was once more mustered. The wretched reports and such, fomenting a new wave of abolitionism to bring cease to this, to bring cease to this abominable Eastern trade. Such culminating, at its zenith, in the Anglo-Zanzibar War of the 27th of August, 1896, which ceased after a mere 38 minutes, and is coincidentally known as history's briefest war. Hence, one may see the empire as having been constructed, just as it was justified, by abolitionism, as many a casus belli, reason for war in Latin, was derived from this holy quest. Unfortunately, the final waning vestiges of this abominable trade remained until 1937 in the empire, particularly such in the protectorates of Nigeria and Bahrain. Nigeria, being in West Africa, and Bahrain in Arabia, were both areas from which slaves had traditionally been procured from for summary sale. This tardiness, thus, can be ascribed to their protectorate status, limiting British actions within, and how culturally ingrained the practice, however repugnant, was. Thus, we may see that empire for Britain was not merely a thing to exploit, but a thing to nurture, this babe suckling off the mother country, the holy cause of slavery. I pray I have sufficiently elucidated you to the lengths which Britain elected for, and their pioneer status in abolitionism. This is a rather recondite topic, with many sophists content to merely declaim Europe as barbarous for its brief, however in that time extensive, use of slavery, however mendaciously forsake the import of Europe in expunging such an institution as slavery, one which Europe, and Europe alone, engendered, and of Europe, Britain as its harbinger. If there is anything erroneous, you needn't refrain from disabusing any figures or assertions I postulate. I merely pontificate with aid from data, as we all ought. Once more, it would be most satisfactory if you delighted in this disquisition and its prior half. By the by, if you have yet to watch it, I implore you to do so. Unfortunately, the great civilizing mission that Britain set upon was never fully concluded, with slavery still endemic to this dear world of ours. However, we may satisfy ourselves with our ancestors' efforts, and we ought to applaud the endeavours of today's abolitionists in continuing its crusade. Donate if you desire, or merely apprise yourself to the issue if you so wish. Anyhow, thank you for watching. Any feedback would be greatly appreciated from myself. And once more, a most sincere goodbye.